So I'm wondering, how do the two texts compare and how do they contrast? The first thing I need to do is tell the important points of both texts. First is the story of Ruby Bridges. I know that in this text, in the 1960s, a judge decided that Ruby should go to an all-white school because separate schools were not fair. Ruby had to be protected by federal marshals every day because there was an angry crowd that didn't want her to go to school there. Ruby used her courage to still learn in an empty classroom with her teacher, Mrs. Henry. She prayed every day for God to forgive those people outside of her school. Now, in this second text, I know it's still about Ruby Bridges, but I'm going to think about the important points that were in this text. I know that in the 1960s, many places were segregated, but the government decided for Ruby to go to an all-white school. An angry crowd of people did not want her to go, but she still learned every day alone with her teacher, Mrs. Henry. Many famous people were inspired by Ruby's bravery. Slowly, more students came back to learn with Ruby, and now that she's an adult, Ruby still shares her story to encourage people to be kind. Now I need to think to myself, how do these stories compare, or what was the same? Now I remember in both of these stories, they both had Ruby, they both had Mrs. Henry, so I know that the stories compare because they both had the characters Ruby and Mrs. Henry. Now I'm going to use this graphic organizer called a Venn diagram, where I have the two texts on the side and space to tell what was different about them. Then I have a space in the middle to tell what was the same about them. Now here's that same idea that I had, but in a Venn diagram. I know that these texts compare because both have Ruby and Mrs. Henry. So I put that in the middle of the Venn diagram to show that that was the same in both texts. Now I need to think about how the stories contrast, or what was different. I know that the stories contrast because one text tells about the judge and the other girls that had to go to all-white schools. That's the story of Ruby Bridges. But the other text doesn't, and Ruby Bridges goes to school. Here's that same idea in a Venn diagram. You can see that in the story of Ruby Bridges, it includes the judge and the other girls. And in Ruby Bridges Goes to School, it does not tell about the judge and the other girls. Now here are my sentences about how I compare and contrast the story of Ruby Bridges and Ruby Bridges Goes to School. These texts compare because they both had the characters Ruby and Mrs. Henry. These texts contrast because one text tells about a judge and the other girls, but the other text doesn't. So now that I've compared and contrasted the two texts, tell me about what steps I used and what questions you heard me ask.